The plane hadn't even left the runway, and already the tension between Meredith Marks and Britani Bateman was thick enough to cut with a cocktail stirrer. What Heather Gay would later reveal is that everything the cameras caught on Real Housewives of Salt Lake City was only the tip of an iceberg ready to sink the whole first-class cabin. And tonight, we're diving into the chaos that production didn't show. Before we jump in, if you love piping hot housewives drama, shocking behind-the-scenes tea, and stories that Bravo never wants you to know, make sure you hit like and subscribe to this channel. It tells YouTube you want more of this and helps our little corner of chaos grow. Now let's get into it. It all begins at the tail end of the Below Deck Down Under crossover trip, a vacation that should have been glamorous but instead turned into a battlefield of accusations, inflatable unicorns, and housewives behaving like castaways on the verge of mutiny. Britani Bateman dropped a bombshell in episode 8 when she claimed that Seth Marks, Meredith's husband, had a mistress. A claim like that doesn't just burn bridges, it nukes them. Meredith's reaction was swift, dramatic, and perfectly on brand. She yeeted Britani's inflatable unicorn into the ocean like it was toxic waste. Then she stormed off with a fury that would have made Poseidon step aside. But the airport showdown that followed? That was merely a warm-up. According to Heather Gay, the real meltdown happened mid-air. A fight so loud, so intense, and so persistent that even the flight attendants didn't know whether to pass out peanuts or life jackets. And when Andy Cohen brought this up on Watch What Happens Live, Heather didn't hold back. She confirmed that while Meredith insisted the feud lasted only 15 minutes, that number was about as realistic as a housewife's apology. Mary Cosby, never one to sugarcoat, or frankly, even coat anything at all, jumped into episode 9 like a truth sniper. She claimed Meredith was yelling throughout the entire flight, but Meredith shot back, saying Mary was asleep most of the time. It became a housewives version of he said, she said, except instead of he, it was an entire cast of women who don't agree on the time of day, let alone a transcontinental meltdown. When Andy pressed Heather for her take, she practically sighed with relief, because finally someone was asking the right question. Heather described Meredith arriving like a gentle soprano, while Mary cut through her explanation with the bluntness of a sledgehammer. To Heather, the idea that the yelling only lasted 15 minutes was laughable. 15? 30? It was more than that, she insisted. But the wildest detail wasn't even about the yelling. It was about who was on that plane. Meredith defended herself by saying that if her behavior was truly out of control, an air marshal would have intervened. But Heather shut that down with a dose of reality that only a Bravo insider could deliver. According to her, the first-class cabin was basically a housewives takeover, filled with cast members and production, which meant one thing: no one was going to step in. It wasn't a real no-fly situation. It was a celebrity no-touch zone, the kind of place where you could probably start a small argument, medium argument, or full-blown opera-worthy screaming match without anyone lifting a finger. The plane, the crew, the chaos, it was all enveloped in a bubble of Bravo immunity. And that's where the real story begins, because Heather didn't just hint at drama. She hinted that the in-flight meltdown went far beyond anything anyone has admitted on camera. Conflicting stories, raised voices, a cabin full of housewives. This was less a flight and more an airborne arena. And we are just getting started. What most viewers don't realize is that the energy on that plane didn't start at boarding. It had been building for hours. After the airport confrontation, where Meredith unleashed enough icy fury to freeze the entire terminal, production hoped the cast would calm down once they were comfortably seated. But housewives don't calm down. They simmer, and then they explode. The moment the cabin doors closed, the tension became impossible to ignore. According to Heather, it was like locking wild animals in a luxury cage. Every glance carried attitude. Every sigh carried judgment. And every tiny noise, real or imagined, added fuel to the fire. Britani sat rigidly in her seat, avoiding eye contact with Meredith. Meanwhile, Meredith sat upright, poised, clutching her designer throw like she was one deep breath away from launching into round 2. Housewives have fought in restaurants, boats, sprinter vans, and ski chalets, but a sealed metal tube at 30,000 feet? That was new battlefield territory. Heather noted that overhearing their murmurs was like listening through a wall made of drama. The whispers were sharp, the tones were clipped, and then, as if fate wanted to stir the pot, turbulence hit. Just light turbulence, which for most people means nothing. But for these women, it was a match on gasoline. Britani shifted. Meredith stiffened. Someone across the aisle muttered something, and suddenly Meredith's composure cracked like thin ice. Her voice rose, not in a scream, but in that infamous Meredith Marks cadence, slow, deliberate, and dripping with tension. It wasn't a yell, not yet, but it was loud enough that everyone within 10 rows knew something was brewing. Britani fired back, quiet, but firm. A denial. A remark about the accusation. A clarification. No one's quite sure what the spark was, because Heather only described the aftermath. But whatever it was, it triggered the moment Mary Cosby referred to when she said Meredith yelled throughout the flight. Heather explained that the yelling wasn't one long, continuous scream, but waves. Periods of strained silence followed by sharp exchanges that would flare suddenly, like an engine misfiring. Mary, reportedly asleep for most of the flight, still caught enough glimpses of the chaos to make her claims on episode 9. The cabin became divided. Some castmates pretended to sleep. Others put in earbuds they weren't actually using. A few stared at the seat in front of them with the intensity of passengers rethinking all life decisions that led them to this moment. Meanwhile, production sat tight, doing what production does best, documenting everything while staying completely, utterly silent. But the real twist? According to Heather, the flight attendants knew exactly who they were dealing with. Housewives. Bravo. A group famous for emotional hurricanes and public meltdowns. So instead of intervening, the crew kept their distance. They served sparkling water with caution. They delivered snacks with a neutral expression. They walked past the first-class cabin like they were entering a lion enclosure. Calm on the outside, praying on the inside. And when Meredith later insisted that an air marshal would have stepped in if things were truly that bad, Heather nearly laughed. Because the truth was crystal clear. Nobody on that flight wanted to be responsible for escalating Housewives drama. Not the attendants, not the pilots, not the passengers. The safest strategy was simple. Let them tire themselves out. But what the cameras didn't show was that somewhere mid-flight, the argument reached a point where even the bravest housewives paused. A moment when the cabin fell into an eerie silence, as if everyone collectively wondered what was going to happen next. Because this fight wasn't just about the mistress rumor anymore. It was about pride, about betrayal, about reputations at stake, about the unspoken rule that housewives never back down. And when Heather teased that the fight lasted far longer than the 15 minutes Meredith claimed, she wasn't exaggerating. By her account, the argument ebbed and flowed for hours, long enough for drinks to be served, collected, and served again. But something else happened that Heather didn't fully spell out on TV, something unspoken that shifted the dynamic of the entire cast for the rest of the trip. Somewhere over the Pacific, long after the initial yelling subsided, the cabin settled into a strange quiet. Not peaceful, never peaceful with this group, but a heavy, loaded silence. One of those silences where everyone is pretending to rest, pretending not to listen, pretending not to hold their breath. Yet every ear is tuned to the simmering tension between Meredith and Britani. And then, the turning point happened. According to Heather, there was a moment when Meredith wasn't yelling, wasn't muttering, wasn't lecturing in her signature sing-song voice. Instead, she leaned forward, her tone low, her words sharp, but her voice steady. She wasn't performing anymore. She wasn't talking to an audience or defending herself for cameras. This was raw, direct, a side of Meredith that even castmates rarely get to see. She told Britani that the accusation about Seth wasn't just hurtful, it was calculated, a dagger thrown with intent, a storyline choice, and Britani shot back with equal force. She insisted she didn't fabricate anything, that she heard whispers, that production knew what she knew, and that she'd said what she said because no one else had the courage to speak it out loud. This wasn't about a rumor anymore. It was about truth, narrative, and whose reality the cast would believe. Heather described the energy in that moment as electric, the kind of tension that makes even the loudest housewives lean back and reconsider their next move. The rest of the cabin watched in silence, some pretending not to, others openly staring. Even Mary, half awake and half annoyed, cracked an eye open long enough to whisper her iconic judgmental hum. Then, right when it felt like the argument was about to erupt into a full-scale war, Meredith went quiet. Not defeated, never that, but done. The kind of done that only housewives can achieve, where they decide the conversation is beneath them. She leaned back, crossed her arms, and stared forward with that icy posture that practically vibrates with silent fury. Britani didn't speak after that. Heather didn't intervene. No one moved. The plane kept cruising. The attendants carried on with their service. But the entire first-class cabin felt like a high-stakes courtroom where a verdict had been silently delivered. By the time wheels touched down, the cast had already rehearsed the version of events they would present publicly. Short, minimized, controlled. A 15-minute disagreement with raised voices. Nothing dramatic, nothing chaotic, nothing Housewives-level explosive. But Heather's truth slipped out on Watch What Happens Live. Unraveling the story, Bravo tried to wrap neatly with a bow. The fight didn't last 15 minutes. Not even close. It lasted long enough to alter alliances. Long enough to create fractures that would carry through the rest of the season. Long enough to become the kind of behind-the-scenes legend that fans would only hear whispers about.